One of my favorite snacks at Disneyland is the lobster roll you get at this little quick service place by the sailing ship Columbia. And I was enjoying my lobster roll out between New Orleans Square and Critter Country. And I look over and I see a bird. Not only a bird, the weirdest bird. The weirdest bird ever with interesting feet. Like, they look like a Christmas cactus feet. And that got me wondering, what other kinds of animals live at Disneyland, and how do we, as humans, live with them? So I thought I would ask a friend and expert on the subject. So why don't we begin by introducing everyone to yourself and what can you do?
Sure. So hi, I'm Cheryl, the roving naturalist, and on my channel I'd like to answer all of the questions you never knew you had about how humans and the environment interact. So it's a lot of environmental science and biology content, but through the lens of human culture and art and psychology and things like that.
Excellent. So there is a question I know I need to ask, which is, do you know who my cactus-footed friend is? I did some Googling cactus-footed bird, and it said American coot. Is that an unusual bird for this area, or is...
So, yeah, American coots are actually one of my favorite water birds because they're so silly. But yeah, they have sort of big, like, webby bits on their toes, and there are several kinds of water bird all over the world. Wattle jacanas are another that have these funny pads on their toes, and yeah, it just sort of helps them paddle through water, or if they're walking on top of like lily pads and things, it helps distribute their weight, much in the same way that like camels have big feet or moose have big feet that splay out and help them walk on snow or sand or something like that. So yeah, American coots are super adorable and I love them. They're very silly. But yeah, they're a fairly common water bird sort of all over the continent. Yeah.
Very cool. So Disneyland is an example of an urban ecosystem. How can we define that as laymen?
Okay, so, well, of course, an ecosystem is just the community of animals and plants that live in a certain area. But what's interesting and unique about urban ecosystems is that they sort of overlap with or exist within urban landscapes, right? So, like this garden that we're standing in is in between hotel buildings, but it's this little planted artificial community, but still there are plants and there are animals living in here, and so it's this really interesting interface between natural systems that are able to coexist with things like light pollution and air pollution and concrete and smog and all of that fun stuff. Yeah, so they're all organisms that are able to eke out a living here, and so often in an urban ecosystem you find a lot of animals and plants that are generalists, but are also really good at adapting to changing situations. So think like coyotes are always my favorite urban ecosystem example because they are just so easygoing and they're able to deal with basically any situation you throw at them.
Awesome. And I know a lot of times when we think of urban ecosystems, we think of like city buildings with peregrine falcons and raccoons, and we so rarely think of gardens in like Central Park and Disneyland, because they're manufactured for human enjoyment, but the animals and plants and the ecosystem get a bonus out of it too.
Yes.
So why do you think maybe a theme park in particular would make a good habitat for animals?
Well, so theme parks are interesting because they sort of vary in the amount of like green space that people include in them, but very often there is green space because it's pretty and we like it. So, you know, it's good for the plants, especially because they were intentionally put there by humans, so they got a little help colonizing an area that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. But also when you think about a theme park, like they close down at night, and so there is an amount of time where this urban ecosystem can sort of like have a reset, as it were, and, you know, have some time where there aren't at least as many humans, if not any humans, in that space. And so nocturnal or crepuscular animals, so that's those that are awake at dawn and dusk, might have time to be active and do their thing in a less disrupted space, or it's just a downtime, so animals might be able to come out of hiding or decide that that's a lower stress time to be active. And then there's also all of the things that humans bring with them. I'm thinking specifically of dropped food items.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, so lots of dropped food items that tend to be really high calorie and high sugar, which are really high value foods for animals. So yeah, all of that dropped food on the ground is a really ready and easy to find food source for the animals living in a park. They don't necessarily have to forage in the same way they might have to in a forest, because it's just right there on the sidewalk for them.
Yeah, and I bet since that attracts a lot of like prey animals, then a lot of more predator animals will see that there's a higher population there.
Exactly, especially when you think about, like I said, out on this sidewalk, right? Like, the sidewalk doesn't have any cover, there's no vegetation, so if I was a mouse or a cockroach hanging out on the sidewalk, it's very easy for a predator, you know, flying overhead or walking along the side of the sidewalk to see me because I don't have any cover, and also often because there's like street lamps and stuff, so it makes it very visible. So yeah, you can have this really great food chain based off of like dropped popcorn, which is kind of amazing to me.
And we're a part of it.
Yeah.
Another thing about theme parks is there are a lot of places that need to be built that aren't necessarily inhabited by humans. There's very low traffic, but there are a lot of structures, like specifically like roller coasters or show buildings that nobody goes into. They just look nice or house equipment. That's a lot of great places for maybe an animal to nest or create a home.
Absolutely. Those would provide a lot of refugia or like places for them to hide because it provides shade or because it provides small nooks and crannies for them to hang out in. Yeah.
And then because humans don't really need to go in these spaces, it's kind of symbiotic in a way.
Yeah, almost, yeah.
It's like, I don't need to go where the roller coaster could cut my head off.
No.
The raccoons can have a nest there.
Yes.
They're safer.
They're more nimble too, so
exactly.
yeah.
And now, an incomplete list of common vertebrates and selected arthropods at Disneyland that I know of. American coots, Canadian geese, cormorants, mallards, sparrows, seagulls, pigeons, egrets, hummingbirds, squirrels, mice, raccoons, frogs, red-eared slider turtles, crayfish, assorted actual fish, feral cats.
Are those all the usual suspects for an urban ecosystem, or do we have any weird outliers there?
So definitely a lot of those. I mean, seagulls, pigeons, like everybody thinks about pigeons in cities. Things like Canada geese do especially well in human systems. So yeah, those aren't a surprise. The raccoons, obviously. The red-eared sliders don't especially surprise me, although yeah, you said all of the waterways in Disney are artificial, so like they didn't make it there on their own, but that makes sense because red-eared sliders aren't actually from this part of the country. They're from way deep in the southeast.
Really?
But yes, they have become invasive over most of North America because they're a very popular pet animal. So if you find one in a natural waterway around here, it would probably be an escaped pet or the son or grandson of someone's escaped pet or someone's abandoned pet. You know, water turtles are sort of a higher maintenance pet animal because you have to clean the tank and stuff like that. And so yeah, like when people get tired of their turtle, they just dump it in a stream thinking, oh, that's where it lives. And then we wind up with this invasive species problem. But in Disney, I would guess that they probably intentionally put them there.
That is entirely possible.
To serve as like, oh, they're big turtles with pretty markings, so like they're probably intentionally in there to provide some pond life. And they're hardy, they survive well, so it makes sense to put them in the Disney park as opposed to trying to use like a native species of water turtle. Some of the other water birds and the hummingbirds I'm a little surprised at, like the egrets and the coots and the hummingbirds. Those are animals that I would expect normally to prefer sort of like lower stress environments, especially because egrets are stalking predators, so they do the thing where they very, very, very slowly like play the statue game, walk through the water, and wait for fish to sort of congregate around their legs and then jab down and get them. And I would assume that hunting strategy would be more difficult in an area with a lot of noise. But maybe the birds around here have just sort of decided, well, there are fish in those ponds or something else that I can eat. I might as well go exploit that. Because there's nobody else hunting here, so that's always, a good option. And then as far as the hummingbirds, like there are a lot of species of hummingbirds around here, like in this part of California, and actually just west of the Rockies in general. And they all need to eat nectar from flowers, right? Well, the Disney parks and actually just like a lot of the landscaping here in LA is very full of flowers. Yes. So even though, again, I wouldn't necessarily expect the hummingbirds to love sort of the higher stress environment of an urban ecosystem or of the amusement park, there are just so many flowers that it might be worth the risk for them. Yeah.
And they could also be migratory, and they could be going on vacation
true.
to Disneyland on their way down south.
That's true.
So the turtles pose an interesting question to me. How do some of these animals get here? Because as far as I know, I don't think Disney knowingly stocks their ponds the way some other parks do. I know Knott's Berry Farm has koi in their pond, but as far as I know, they don't stock it for aesthetics.
Oh, interesting. Huh. In that case, yeah, maybe the turtles are, releases by someone. And same thing with the crayfish, or maybe also with the crayfish, because of the way their life cycle works. Their eggs or, their larvae could have been attached to the bottom of a boat or the bilge of a boat or the bottom of one of the canoes or even someone's water shoe, right? And transported into these waterways. So there's, that's actually one of the really interesting and sad things about a lot of waterways in the United States is that they've become choked with invasive species. Think zebra mussels, lots of invasive plants, and some of the invasive fish that we've got because people don't do a good job of rinsing off their shoes and the bottoms of their boats or their canoe paddles when they move from one waterway to another. And so we're able to transfer these microscopic larvae or eggs from one place to another. So yeah, if Disney is not intentionally stocking their ponds, then those things still had to be brought there somehow because all the water is artificial. But yeah, they were probably unintentionally brought there in many cases, or again, pet turtle releases is a really common way for red-eared sliders to wind up places. Yeah.
It is a very suburban area.
Exactly.
Around here. That's entirely likely.
Yeah.
Possibly even the pipes that bring in the water to the waterways might already have those invasive species in there.
It really depends on whether or not they've got grading that's fine enough to keep things like that out.
Right.
Yeah.
And another animal in this ecosystem we haven't talked a lot about is the humans. So what part do we as humans play in this ecosystem, either actively or passively?
Ooh, how much time do you have? So that's one of the things that I love talking to people about is this idea that we really can't separate humans from any ecosystem. Basically every ecosystem on Earth has been in some way indirectly affected by us if you think about things like climate change and pollution, or directly affected by us because we extract resources or we turn things into parks and manage them, or we actually create them like in these urban parks. So yeah, everything has the mark of humans on it somehow. Specifically in the park ecosystem, yeah, it's everything from, the topsoil was probably brought in because it tends to be very sandy and dusty out here in Southern California, but the soil that I see on the ground behind us is a much darker, richer soil with a lot of nutrients in it. So yeah, I'm guessing that was topsoil that was brought in, and with that comes earthworms and other invertebrates and microorganisms that make the soil healthy and happy so that the plants that we then bring in and put here can grow. And then again, Southern California, it's dry and dusty, so these things have to be watered. They wouldn't survive even if you gave them nice topsoil and you put them there. They would die because it's just too dry. So they also get watered. So basically, yeah, we are entirely sponsoring, I guess, the growth of these plants in a park like this. So yeah, they are here at our whim, which is really sort of an interesting situation. And then, yeah, how humans build the spaces. You talked about all of those areas that humans built but didn't necessarily spend a lot of time in that provide habitats for these animals, and yeah, how we choose to arrange them and what they're made out of changes who can live there, basically, right? So a wooden structure might be more conducive to a wide variety of animals living there than a metal structure because the wood fibers provide nesting material for a lot of animals or things like that. So yeah, all of those sort of how we build and structure the ecosystem effects are one thing, and then yeah, how we interact with the system is a whole another part of it, because we are dropping food on the ground, or we are turning off the lights, or we are running around screaming, or all of those sorts of things that change the stress level of the area. And then of course we can also get into the sort of unfortunate fact of wildlife interactions with humans, many of which are sort of unintentional and accidental, but then there's also intentional on the part of the human going up and handling animals, or especially in theme parks and zoos and things, feeding animals, and those are incredibly dangerous for both the humans and the animals involved, both in the short term and in the long term. So yeah, how we interact with the ecosystem and the organisms once they're there is really interesting, but it's material for multiple videos all on its own.
I know one positive example is Disneyland's rather notorious population of feral cats. It's something that is mutually beneficial for the cats because they get a habitat, and for Disney because they're natural mousers, so they can cut down on the pest population while they don't have to use as many pesticides. And there are actually vets on staff to make sure that cats are doing okay, and if they find any litters, the kittens are then taken and spayed and then returned back to their habitat to keep the population from getting out of control. And then I do know there are food bowls left out for the cats that have like their vitamins in them, so they get any nutrients they're missing from their natural population. And I know that a lot of times the upkeep of the cats is just as much for the benefit of the guests, because kids don't want to see dead kitties strewn about the park, but that also does help the cat population and keep the ecosystem going.
I guess feral cats and outdoor cats are sort of an odd case because, as you say, they can provide mouse population control, but a lot of environmentalists would say, well, there are maybe better or different ways that could also be achieved, because when we think about cats, especially if the cats are actually being fed supplementally, cats hunt and kill even if they are being fed. And we see this a lot in urban systems and suburban systems, that, people who have outdoor pet cats, not just feral cats, but like, oh, that's my pet, I put out a bowl of food for it, it's still going to be killing small mammals and also birds. And I'm sure that the songbirds in Disney Park are not like their target when they've got the cats, but that's definitely a group of animals that's also going to be affected. And so this is this sort of like tricky balance between like, well, how much benefit are they actually providing versus like how much could they be being destructive. And so a lot of times, at least in a more natural ecosystem or in suburbia and stuff, we would advocate for making habitats for natural predators, so coyotes and bobcats and snakes, which are all predators of mice, making the habitat more conducive to them. In the Disney park, that might be a little harder. So yeah, we can totally understand the benefits that the feral cats provide, but that is sort of like a tricky, weird situation.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And then just as a follow-up to that question, what can we as humans who visit Disney parks do to help the ecosystem, or at least minimize our imprint upon it?
Yes. So, like I was talking about, interactions with wildlife are, really not a good idea for anybody. So, looking at and admiring and asking questions about the egrets or the raccoons or whatever is great. And I totally encourage people to do that and to spend time watching them because they're fascinating animals. But please don't feed them. It's not good for them for so many reasons, and it cannot be good for you too. Feeding animals is not good for them because the food that we are handing them is usually something, like I said, it's very high calorie and high sugar, and that's not good for them because that's not the normal food that they are used to receiving, and so their bodies are going to process it very differently, and it can be detrimental to them, especially if you think about people throwing bread to ducks. The bread can sort of fill up their stomachs, which means that they don't get enough of the normal food that they eat, and so they wind up missing out on nutrients. Feeding bread to ducks can actually result in something pretty severe called angel wing. I don't recommend looking up pictures unless you're sure you're going to be okay with this, but basically it causes their wings to like malform.
Oh,
and
yes.
And then those birds are basically land-bound. They can't fly because their wings are deformed. So feeding animals, not a good idea because it can hurt them, make them sick, even cause them to die from malnutrition. But it can also cause them to become dependent on humans, and that's problematic because being dependent on humans, again, it means that they're not good at feeding themselves, but it also might mean that they start engaging in really negative and dangerous behaviors. So think about geese at your local park who might be so used to being fed that anytime they see a human, they expect that human to give them food.
Right.
And so they come up to you, and if you don't feed them, they bite you, right? And so that's...
Especially with all those children at
Yeah.
Disneyland, you might not, proper space from an animal.
Exactly. So that's really bad, because then now we've got a dangerous human-wildlife interaction happening where there's biting, and so many times if an animal, especially predator animals, but if an animal bites humans or is hurting humans in some way, like that animal is most likely going to be caught and killed.
Right.
Because it's hurting us. And it wasn't really that animal's fault. It just came to expect something from humans. So yeah, we want to make sure that people aren't being hurt by animals that they're trying to interact with, and we also want to make sure that the animals aren't being hurt by humans or taught sort of bad behaviors that's going to get them hurt in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just an important thing to remember is that, like, because Disneyland is such a manufactured space and we expect it to all be just laid out for our enjoyment, and that's something that's part of the video, is that everything is intentionally put there, but it is also a habitat. It's an interaction with the natural world. Everything is. Just like if you see a mouse at Disneyland, that's also their home too.
Yeah. Animals are going to be animals, and we can't do a whole lot to change that, so we have to respect that and work within that system.
Yeah. So just because it's an artistic space does not mean it isn't also a natural space. So thank you so much for joining me on our natural journey of Disneyland. I learned so much today.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you had great questions.
You guys did too. Thank you. Where can we find your stuff?
Oh, yes.
Once again?
So there's probably going to be links to my channel somewhere around here, but it's The Roving Naturalist, and you should come on over because we're going to do a video over there talking about the animal characters in Disney and other cartoons. So you should come watch more of us over there.
All right. Thank you guys. See you guys later.